Hey guys, Mr. Star here. First of all, shout out to Vic Chun, one of my favorite Guild War guide makers from Epic 7. I'm just gonna be following bro style of basically doing topless guide videos for starsavior. I just wanted to make a really fast little update for the current RTA PvP tier list in starsavior based on my current experience. So as you guys can see, I am currently the rank 1 in the entire global server. But frankly speaking, everybody in like the top 10, they're all around the same caliber. It just depends on like who plays a little bit more and who plays a little bit less and who gets screwed over by the RNG. So I would say it doesn't really mean too much, but I would definitely say I have a pretty decent understanding of how the drafting is going to be working, especially with the release of Wedding Epindel, right? So I'm just going to be going through my personal tier list, my builds for all of my units. But the reason why I want to get this video out right now is because I believe next week on the 25th of June, we are going to be getting Carnelia, as you guys can see right here. And from what I've seen from this kid, she appears to have a immortal mechanic. So if I remember correctly, I actually play against this particular unit back in JP server, where essentially once you hit her to 1 HP, you can no longer deal any lethal damage to her. So she's basically going to stay on field with that one special immortal buff, leaving her at 1 HP. Very reminiscent of Tryndamere, or if you guys have played Counterside back in the past, there was this unit called Veronica, which is like a fire battlemate that will remain at 1 HP and deals a lot of damage. So I think out of all of the units that we have seen so far, this brand new Chaos Caster Carnelia, it is most likely going to be changing quite a significant amount of meta shift, at least when she's going to be releasing, right? So I figure if I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the current meta right now, so that you guys can prepare to climb a little bit more before she actually comes out. And I would say from my personal experience so far, the overall success rate, I would probably classify at roughly 60 to 65%, which is honestly really good in when it comes to like this kind of like RNG heavy based RTA mechanics, right? So without further ado, let's just jump straight into the tier list first. So this is going to be the tier list I have cooked up for starsavior, and after I go through the tier list, like for each individual tiers, I will also show you guys my personal builds that I'm going to be using for my RTA experience, which eventually got me to the current caliber at roughly 3500 elo. I think I will be pushing for Eternium, which is 4000 elo after Carnelia comes out, because I don't think there's any going to be any rush for it. And next week is going to be a really busy week, as we are going to be heading leaning up towards LA Anime Expo. Right? So with that being established, I would say that my 3 tier 0 units as of right now, which is pretty much you must pick them as your first pick, or you must ban them if you are not going to be playing them, and that is going to be Wedding Carmen, Hilde, as well as Rosaria. The reason is honestly very simple. For Wedding Carmen, she is essentially the best quote-unquote sustain that we actually have in the game, even stronger than a defender, because you are basically forced to hit Wedding Carmen first over the enemy DPS. So if you're going to be building a very tanky Wedding Carmen, the amount of utility you get from basically stalling out the total amount of field time your main DPS can stay, it is going to give you pretty much the highest value in the entire game. Because for RTA drafting, essentially who wins in these kind of like very fast-paced matches, it is to see which of your main DPS stays on field the longest. And back in those days when you basically played tank down, those meta has kind of went away because we have access to a lot of anti-tank down units, such as, for example, Tyria, as well as running Epindel. So at this point, it really is just whose main DPS remains on the field for the longest amount of time, and that is gonna be achieved by running Wedding Carmen, because she gives you the ridiculous barrier, the ridiculous 40% damage split, as well as action value advance. So definitely going to be a tier 0 option. For Hilde, I would say she's still really consistent, but it's pretty much going to be a 50-50. So if you're not going to be winning your 50-50s and getting a preemptive guard, then it is what it is. But if you do win those 50-50s, then it is going to give you an absolutely insane amount of value where pretty much no other DPS can get through and actually hit your main DPS. But aside from that, Hilde herself is also going to be really tanky, on top of the taunt on the first target on the action bar. So if you taunt the enemy target, it basically cancels out one of the turns as well, on top of just being really tanky. So Hilde is still just super annoying to deal with. And even though you could say you want to run units like Wedding Epindel or Tyria against Hilde, it doesn't really necessarily work, Because, for example, if you're going to be running Tyria, and if the enemy runs like Hilde as well as Haiti, and if Haiti is the one that gets the 3 stacks, if Hilde jumps in front of Haiti, you actually don't let go of your Tyria burst, which is just really, really unfortunate. And then for Wedding Epindel, the logic is still pretty much the same, where Hilde is just way, way too tanky, and you cannot actually aim your Wedding Ependel's S2 on the squishy DPS if Hilde is going to block, which is just super annoying to deal with. So I would say Hilde is still going to be a very, very strong tier 0. And Rosaria is still pretty much going to be one of, if not the best DPS we have in RTA. Not only does she have absolutely ridiculous amounts of damage, right? AoE, defense down, 50% action very advanced, as well as the 40% lock life, where the enemy cannot one-shot Rosaria no matter what. So the only consistent way that you can actually deal with a Rosaria, it is pretty much Belle or Carmen. I feel that Belle is going to be a little bit more consistent because Belle actually does quite a decent chunk of damage herself. So if you can actually crit with your S3 against Rosaria, removing her S3 by silencing as well as the attack buff, then you're going to be in a super good position. Whereas for Carmen, although you can Carmen taunt the Rosaria, Carmen herself doesn't really do that much damage, so you might not have enough time to actually kill Rosaria, right? So that is pretty much going to be our top 3 units. So if I were to jump straight into my personal account right here, you can kind of just see how I build them up for myself. So for my Rosaria, it is pretty much a very, very classic 4-piece crit rate into 2-piece Fighting Spirit. For your highest amount of damage, exact same gear that I'm going to be running on the Gauntlet as well. I am not going for the crit damage set because if I were to miss my crit, it just feels really, really bad. So I just want to be a little bit more consistent. 192 speed to be decently fast, and I would say most of my DPS, if I am going to be running them in RTA, I prefer to have all of them above 180 so they do not get outsped by the slower DPSs, which is pretty common when it comes to the slightly lower elo players, right? So that is going to be my Rosaria. And then for my Hilde, actually, let's take a look at Wedding Carmen first. For my Wedding Carmen, I actually make her to be a lot slower because I'm giving her a HP main stat. Because for Wedding Carmen, you don't really care too much if she's gonna be getting an extra turn, but you really, really care if she can survive, especially if the enemy lets Wedding Carmen through, which means that the moment Wedding Carmen hits on field, the enemy's number 1 priority is most likely going to be Wedding Carmen if she is protecting just a single DPS. If you have 2 different DPS, they will aim the other DPS first, but because of the way that Wedding Carmen works, you are pretty much quote-unquote immune to all those AoE damage. Because anyone does AoE, it will trigger our Wedding Carmen's S2, so you're still going to be able to push up 30% action very advanced on top of healing your units with this massive heal as well as a cleanse or debuff. So this is my personal Wedding Carmen running on the BX set. So just for the highest possible amount of HP regeneration and just stacking on as much HP and as much defense, just making her as bulky as possible. For the tracers, I honestly don't think you need to worry about it too much. I did level this to level 8 just for the additional 10% action gauge. Other than that, it is not going to be too important. Then Ultimate is just going for the cooldown increase. And then for my Hilde, it's pretty much going to be my day 1 Hilde. I don't think this Hilde's build actually changed at all ever since I got her like almost 2 months ago. I'm pretty much going to be running her on the classic 4-piece HP into 2-piece barrier with a set on DX4 for a little bit more speed, just because I know that the enemies do not necessarily aim Hilde. They always want to aim your TPS or rather your squishies. So because of that, your Hilde should be getting a little bit higher speed so that she can cast an S3 and maybe land a lucky taunt to completely disrupt the enemy carrier. So that is going to be our tier 0 DPS. Now moving on into our tier 0.5, I would say for this ranking over here, they're all really, really strong, but it is just not quite as close of a priority compared to our tier 0. So I did give 4 different tier 0.5 being Emily, Faye, Belle, as well as Ashura. All of these 4 units, I have pretty much the highest play rate with Emily, because Emily is a very, very flexible unit that you can pretty much use in almost every single scenario. If you want to play with Welts, you want to play with Belle, you want to play with like Savior, you want to play with squishy DPS, you want to play with casters, Tyria, pretty much anybody in this game can make use of Emily's S2, which is a absolutely absurd amount of barrier on top of the AoE damage and defense up. So just because of the versatility, you can also kind of just take a look at my match records. Almost every single game I have is pretty much always going to be with Emily because I'm just really, really comfortable using her. Of course, it's not going to be a 100% guaranteed win because sometimes RNG still happens, but personally speaking, she's pretty much one of, if not my favorite units to draft. However, if the enemy drafts Emily instead of for myself, then I'm going to be picking up the more offensive units. For example, Wedding Carmen, Rosaria, you can kind of just take a look at the draft over here, as well as my own Welt Ashra, right? So that is pretty much going to be that for Emily. And then for Faye, this unit, I personally don't like playing against an enemy Faye because you are basically praying for 50-50, very similar to Hilde, except for Faye, if you lose your 50-50 and she counters, especially if it's gonna be an AoE squishy DPS, you almost lose the game immediately. So she's a extremely high gamble unit as compared to Hilda. Alright, so if you are gonna be up against an enemy Faye, you literally just have to pray to stall out the game as long as possible. Eventually, when the enemy, or rather the PvP debuff kicks in, when everybody's HP is gonna be lowering, then you can snipe out a Faye at the very last end, where even if she evades your attack, it doesn't really matter anymore. For myself personally, I don't really like playing with Faye because I feel that she's a unit that just relies way too much RNG, and if she cannot proc an S2, like more than, I would say 80% of the value is just completely wasted. So I try to circumvent this by giving my Faye a crit rate set, but I often find myself not really drafting her as frequently. And I would just rather take away the Faye from the enemy's ability to gamble on a 50-50, whereas for myself, I prefer running more AoE DPS, like for example, Tyria, Luna, Belle, Wedding Card, or rather Wedding Epindel, as well as Rosaria, right? So just to remove the layer of RNG, I personally ban Faye a lot for most of my games, but if you do want to gamble, then she's going to be a very solid, I would say, second or third pick. And then for Belle as well as Ashura, I want to say specific to these two units, they pretty much almost come as a pair. So if you draft Welt's Ashura, you draft Belle. If you do not draft Welt's Ashura, you also most of the time do not want to draft Belle. Reason being, if you were to just draft Belle alone and you let your enemy take a Welt's Ashura, you are pretty much forced to use Belle's S3 against the Ashura. Because if you don't do that, the Ashura is just going to cleanse with her own S3, which is pretty much just wasting your Belle's utility. The reason why you want to play Belle is to essentially disable the enemy carry, not to disable the enemy Welt's Ashura. So in a situation where I can combine them both together, I would definitely run them. If I cannot run both of them together, then I will just not pick them whatsoever, right? So that is pretty much how I found quite a decent amount of success during all of my games where I actually picked up my Belle as well as Welt's Ashura. So for example, in this particular, you can see over here, because I did draft my Belle at almost at the very last pick, right? I didn't really have a very good unit use, so I was thinking I'm just gonna be using my Belle to silence the Welt's Ashura, and then maybe my Emily into Roberta into Tyria can just one-shot the Rosaria before she even takes a turn. Unfortunately, it's just not going to be quite enough. So some really bad RNG, so it is what it is. Other than that, I would say for the builds in both Belle as well as Welt's Ashura, for Belle, it is pretty much very consistent. You want to give her your highest possible speed gear so that you can use her to silence the enemy Sarah. If your Belle outspeeds the enemy Sarah, 80% of the time, they pretty much just immediately lose, because with you having access to Ashura as well as Belle, if you disable their Sarah, your Ashura pulls up, then your next two DPS comes in and snipes the DPS, and there's pretty much nothing else for them to do anymore. However, if your Belle misses the silence, then the match will just be incredibly bad against your favor, and that can definitely happen from the 20% effect rest as well as the 20% preemptive guard. So it's just something to be taken care of. For Welt's Ashura, you could actually build this with two separate ways. One way is to pretty much just build it as the highest possible speed, just how you want to build a Belle as well as a Sarah, but you could also go for a tanky Welt's Ashura to play like some kind of a tank down formula where you have a full tank lineup of defenders into a tank Welt's Ashura and slowly just chip away at the enemy's HP for as far as you can. But I would say for that specific playstyle, which is the tank down playstyle, it has went down quite a bit in terms of popularity, because you can kind of just see from our majority of my games here, they are a lot more fast-paced compared to back in those days. Alright, you are almost always going to be facing at least two different DPS, which means that even if you're going to be drafting into double defenders, if you ban one defender, then a single slow Welt's Ashura is not going to be able to save you from your own DPS getting one shot by the enemy's faster DPS, like for example Sarah. And nowadays, because we have a lot of like tanky DPS by themselves as well, like a tank tier, which is the one that I'm personally using, as well as a tank Wedding Epindel. I don't think I can find a build over here. I think this guy also run it. Okay, he's not running a tanky Wedding Epindel, but there's the one that I'm running for myself. So those are going to be pretty much all of our tier 0.5 units. Taking a look into their build, for my Emily, I'm just giving her my fastest, or rather one of my fastest possible defender gears. And this is going to be my PV gear, so don't worry about it. But for my PvP gear, it is going to be a 219 speed, 4-piece HP, or rather 4-piece speed into 2-piece barrier for a little bit more chunk at 60% HP and 58.4% crit rate. I do have a 93.9% crit damage, which is ridiculously high for a crit damage effect, where I would actually prefer if Emily gets a little bit more crit rate, right? So that I don't really have to gamble with the RNG that much. But it is what it is, because the most important for Emily, at least from how I play her, is to yoink first speed, apply a shield, apply a S3, apply defense up, so that your units do not get one shot by the enemy team, right? So that is gonna be my Emily over there. And then for my Bell, is pretty much gonna be my faster speed gear. So I'm gonna be taking a look right here. 238 speed with roughly 55% crit rate, and 158% EHR with 2-piece EHR, just to reduce the possibility of the enemy resisting your hits. But of course, if 20% rest is gonna be 20%, then you don't really have anything else you can do about it. So that is basically how I build a Bell. Not really too big of a change compared to previously. And then my Welt's Ashura is also gonna be very similar to my old Welt's Ashura. 4-piece speed into 2-piece barrier for a little bit 236 speed, little bit of crit rate, a little bit of HP, as well as a little bit of crit damage. Crit damage doesn't really matter, just give her as much speed as possible. And then last but not least, it is gonna be my own Fae. So this is gonna be my PvE Fae, where I run up with full crit damage as well as the AX series, so that she can deal as much damage as possible against PvE content, because you don't really care if you are going to be able to dodge that one hit, because you can always just reset. But against PvP, you definitely want to go, at least for me personally, I prefer running her with a 4-piece crit rate as well as a little bit of bulk. I only went with defense because I have some pretty decent subsets on my 2-piece defense, so I just stuck that on with 95% crit rate, 74% crit damage, as well as 164 speed. The speed is a little bit low, but I can mitigate this because I finally got myself the Kira Light Cone, so I can finally get the 30 speed, right? So that is gonna be my Fae build, but it doesn't really matter, because now I would say that 80% of my games, I pretty much just ban her immediately, so you don't have to worry about it. Now, moving on into our tier 1 unit, this is where majority of all usable DPSs are gonna be, so you are gonna be seeing a very wide variety of different units over here, as well as some other more general purpose defenders and bridges, namely Carmen, namely Heidi, as well as Sarah. So out of all of these DPS, it really doesn't matter too much which one do you want to pick, as long as you give them a decent amount of investment. So for example, normal Claire, which is going to be the Stellar Bloom version, she has seen a really good amount of usage rate, especially with Sarah, because she can ignore pre-end guard completely. So if the enemy does not have a Heidi, which has a 30% damage split, or a Wedding Carmen, the chances of your Claire one-shotting an enemy squishy after your Sarah pulls up is really high. In fact, I have a couple of showcases you are probably going to be seeing from the B-rolls, where my Claire just instantly one-shots the enemy squishy, and the entire fight just becomes 3v4. Very similar to back in my days where I was playing with the Raid normal Charlotte, except that Claire just does way more damage, and you get stealth if you get a kill, and you ignore preemptive guard. So I would say she's a very solid DPS, but the thing is that she really wants to be paired with Sarah, so that she can get first turn, or if you cannot get Sarah, then at least give her an attack buffer like Emily, so that she can do the highest possible amount of damage. I would say a good benchmark for your blue Claire is she can hit more than 4,000 per nuke. That's gonna be a very nice number, because most DPS you see in RTA, it is roughly 3.5 to 3.6k, unless they build a tanky DPS. And then for our Carmen, it is pretty much gonna be another defender acting as a disable. I would say Carmen's utility is very situational, depending if the enemy has some high priority DPS units, namely your Rosaria, your Wedding Epindel, as well as your Charlottes, your Bunny Charlottes, as well as a Tyria. All of these 5 units, 4 of them are going to be sun or going to be fire. So if you do have Carmen against them to break their timeless power as well as taunting, you are going to be able to stall the battle for a lot longer, which then allows your own DPS to deal a substantial amount of value. Then against Rosaria, I personally don't really like running Carmen, just because Carmen doesn't do too much damage, and Rosaria needs to not just disable, but also bring her down into the second life as fast as possible. So that's going to be Carmen. And then for Charlotte, I find her quite useful if you're gonna be able to draft her against a team without Heidi. If the enemy has a Heidi, at least for my personal Charlotte build, she doesn't actually do enough to one-shot a DPS because of Heidi's 30% damage split. Unless you build your Charlotte to be a crit damage 4-piece, where you can get 130-140% crit damage with a crit buff, then you can go in and deal most likely gonna be sniping any DPS in the game. But for that, you are gonna be sacrificing your speed, which I'm not, because I'm still sticking with a relatively fast Charlotte. Alright, and then for our Wedding Epindel, this is gonna be the latest unit that's drawn on our roster roughly last week. I would say that winning Ependel's placement, it is a very fair placement at tier 1 because you can't really draft her into every single team comp because you are going to be very weak, number 1, to units like Roberta because she does have the AoE counter into the S2 unless you break Roberta's toughness bar. And number 2, if the enemy does not have any shields, your S2 into S3 doesn't really have nearly as much damage, and as compared to someone like, for example, if they apply a Emily S2 or they have units like Haiti with the additional shield, that's when your winning Epindel will see a lot of value. And then number 3, you really want to try to hit your 5 stacks of ignition with winning Epindel so that she can get the extra turn. If she cannot get the extra turn from S2 to S3, then her tempo is going to be a lot slower, which might not allow her to actually survive the next round, since the enemies nowadays, like I mentioned, is a very fast-paced tempo game. Okay, this is going to be a very interesting unit, and that is going to be a Naru. So the way that this unit plays, it is pretty much also like another traditional assassin, where you can give yourself a Nova burst to cast an extra turn, triggering your ultimate into a skill. So this S3 into S2 combo can almost one-shot pretty much any DPS in the game as well, especially if they do not have Haiti. Very reminiscent to Rin, like back in those days, because Rin's S2 into S3 can, at least for my Rin, she can actually one-shot a Roberta, even with a Haiti defense. So Naru definitely deals a significant amount of damage without the added risk of AoE, because Rin's S2 is always going to be AoE, where the enemy Roberta can actually counter, and if the Haiti blocks your S3, then it's kind of over, whereas for Naru, it's just going to be pure single target, so it's going to be a little bit safer. And then for Roberta, she's a very nice niche situational pick, so you don't draft her every game, but for those games that you do draft her in, especially against heavy AoE like Tyria, Luna, winning Epindel, Rosaria, or even maybe like Belle and Emily, then Roberta is going to be giving you an insane amount of value from the threat of using your S2. They might not even let go of that AoE just to prevent yourself from casting S2, but if Roberta's job is to just prevent the enemy's S3 AoE, then I would say she already given a ridiculous amount of value for your drafting. And then for Haiti, she is pretty much going to be our outer defender that has been seeing a good amount of usage, especially if we are going to be using her against a team without a Tyria, right? If the enemy does not have a Tyria, your Haiti is going to be able to survive for a significant period of time. And even if the enemy does have Tyria, maybe their enemy is building like a tank Tyria, so they might not even one-shot your Haiti, which is something that I've been seeing quite recently. So it kind of just depends, but I would say the 30% damage split is acting as a very good tool against enemy DPS that moves very fast, like for example your Barney Charlotte, your normal Charlotte, right? Maybe your Claire after you get yourself the slides, or rather the pull out from a Sarah, because while for example, the rework Claire can ignore preemptive guard, she cannot ignore the 30% damage split, which is where Haiti is going to be giving you a ridiculous amount of value. So really nice unit that I think can go into a lot of different teams. And then Lin is pretty much going to be our RTA AoE, where you can use her kit to deal a small amount of AoE at first, and then use the S3 to pretty much just snipe one of the enemy squishes. So her roles, I would say nowadays, is more or less tied to units like Welt's Ashura, because Welt's Ashura pulling up a faster DPS means you are guaranteeing your faster DPS to go against the enemy's slower DPS. So that is where the value is going to be lying. If you are going to be running units like Sarah, I don't really like running Lin, just because you might get countered with a Roberta S2 and you have no other DPS to actually back you up, unless your Sarah's S3 plus Rin's S, which is pretty much just impossible, can actually one-shot a Roberta, right? So that is basically how I use Lin. And then Sarah is pretty much going to be the alternative for Welt's Ashura. This unit is very offense-oriented, unlike Welt's Ashura, which is going to be a little more neutral. So you really want to make sure after you cast your Welt's Ashura, or rather your Sarah's S2, that DPS can either one-shot a squishy or leave them extremely close to death. Sometimes you might use a situation where your Sarah actually pulls up your defenders like Emily just to cast an S2 to S3, so that could also be viable. But majority of the time, she's pretty much going to be pulling up the DPS. It could be Rosaria, it could be an AoE, it could be single target, it doesn't really matter. And then you want to just do as much damage as humanly possible before the enemy actually gets their turn. So this is going to be my normal Claire after the Stellar Bloom. 91% crit into 99% crit damage with 179 speed. Didn't make her too slow. I would say anything above 170, 175 is going to be a decent-ish amount. I would not run the 4-piece speed set on her just because she not having the 30% crit rate, which means it's going to be 61%, it is going to be way more impactful than having a slightly faster 10 speed, right? So that is pretty much going to be our Bunny Claire. Hopefully she can one-shot the enemy DPS, even if that's going to be with a Haiti. If it's going to be squishy enough, she's going to be doing completely fine. Alright, so this is going to be my Carmen, which is pretty much not too much to say. Just give her my, I would say, 3rd or 4th fastest gear after Welt's Ashra, Sarah, as well as I think Belle. So just give her the additional speed, additional EHR, so we have 164% EHR, giving her the 4-piece speed into the 2-piece hit rate, just for the highest possible amount of EHR to land debuffs. If a Carmen cannot land a ton, the battle is just really, really bad because Carmen itself actually does not have a lot of utility aside from the 20% preemptive guard. Alright, so this is going to be the normal shot that I actually use pretty frequently with 214 speed, 56% crit rate, as well as 96.8% crit damage. Actually, this is not my... Okay, this is more suitable. I would say my Charlotte's crit is definitely going to be a little bit more on the lower end, as well as my speed is not going to be that fast. So if you could improve this, I would definitely consider bringing this up by at least, I would say, 10%, because she does give herself 30% crit buff. So with 10% upgrade, that's going to be 96.4 against 96.8, which is going to be a much more consistent number. I have also gone a couple of times where my skills just literally do not proc, despite being a 95% chance to get attack up. So I am legitimately contemplating to see if I should even get this to 100%, but we'll save that for the future. And then this single target damage is pretty much one of the highest nuke in the game, assuming you can actually survive this against an enemy Haiti, right? So that is pretty much going to be there for our Charlotte. Alright, so this is going to be my wedding Epindel, and like I mentioned, I'm basically going to be running her on the HP set and gauntlet. So you can see right here, this is going to be our HP 4-piece into the 2-piece fighting spirit at 170 speed, 73% crit, which is going to be 100%, as well as 89% crit damage. Generally speaking, I am pretty happy with this wedding Carmen, or rather wedding Epindel, and the reason why I built her tanky is because the amount of times that players have tried to kill my wedding Epindel before she gets a turret is absolutely absurd. Same thing for Rosaria, which is why I've built a lot of the DPS that are used very commonly, and they do get aimed a lot to give them the 4-piece HP, especially if they do not need the crit rate, right? Very important thing for wedding Epindel is that her personal traces, you can't really see here anymore, it does give her additional crit rate, which is gonna be a very, very nice little bonus. So you can see right here, sense of attack, crit rate on 3%, then there's gonna be sense of insight, 6% crit rate, as well as a 6% attack, right? So generally a very, very nice journey with a very, very nice savior. Alright, this is pretty much going to be my last unit, which is going to be the exact same speed as my Welt's Ashra, so I have no favoritism whatsoever, aside from Belle being a tad bit faster. Just give her as much speed as possible. There's honestly nothing else left for me to say. Just speed, 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 speed. You can kind of see even our PvP journey is not going to be that good because we have only 1 S. So the overall rating for this particular role, I believe it is less than... Okay, don't worry about it, but pretty much your Sarah doesn't really need to care about the everything else that much. Maybe you can give her a little bit more crit rate, but speed is going to be your #1 priority on Sarah. Alright, so this is gonna be my last segment. That's gonna be a tier 2 DPS and RTA. I am not gonna be going through tier 3 because #1, I either did not use them myself, or #2, they really just do not show up in RTA whatsoever because their kit is simply just a little bit too outdated. Starting off with 3 different stellar blooms being our little message girl. This is going to be the girl that gives you additional action value advance after a basic attack, and then Bestia is just going to be able to trigger quite a few counter attacks, which can maybe see some potential use case if you're going to be up against a more slower tempoed player. Clarissa, I would say she's going to be a little bit falling short compared to Claire because her personal multiplier is going to be a little bit on the weaker end. So although she can have an action value delay, the action value delay is often not going to be fast enough for your rest of the units to take over Clarissa, especially because after her S3, she also gets herself additional buffs, additional speed buff, and everything else. So in terms of versatility, a little bit more difficult, but if you can make your Clarissa work, like for example, Clarissa one-shot your Claire, that's going to be very nice as well. Okay, I would say for these 3 different Stellar Bloom units, aside from Clarissa, they are all a lot more defensive focused. Out of all of them, I haven't Stellar Bloom just yet, so I'm not going to comment on too much. My personal favorite from my own experience is pretty much going to be this little girl right here, where she actually gives you free action value advance whenever she attacks, and she marks herself with a free counter attack rate. So if you're going to be using any AoE, she'll pretty much act like a mini Welt's Ashra to pull out the teams, which is going to be very, very nice. And then Belle, or rather Bestia, into this other girl, which I can't remember the name, it is not going to be too prominent, or just don't really see it enough in PP to make an accurate decision. And then for a Bunny Charlotte, it is pretty much a lot more rare nowadays because she's a little bit too slow. Her tempo needs to do her basic twice into a skill next turn. So if your basic twice cannot kill anyone, then there's gonna be a problem. It will only serve a purpose if you run Bunny Charlotte against a team that's full on defenders, full on sustains, and they don't actually have any pressure when it comes to damage on DPS. That's when Bunny Charlotte can shine a lot, which I believe there should also be another example of that going forward in the future. And then second last unit is gonna be Luna. I would say Luna's usage rate definitely falls by quite a decent amount because Tyria is no longer gonna be able to allow your Luna to freely get hits in, especially after the Heidi giving us the blind, giving out the damage split and everything. So Luna's role, it is gonna be a lot more difficult nowadays. So that's gonna be from personal observation. And then last but certainly not least is gonna be Eliza. I would say Eliza, even though she has a revive, it should only really be used against players whose teams are just not fast enough. Because if you're going to be using your Eliza ultimate, and if the enemy team is actually fast enough to actually outlap your Eliza, they will just kill the revive unit immediately anyways, leaving you with a completely wasted Eliza out. So it really depends on how the speed gods are going to be favoring you on that particular day. Sorry, I literally almost forgot, and that is gonna be our brand new queen, Tyria. I would say Tyria's use. Okay, I'm not really sorting them by their individual levels. Anyway, it is purely just gonna be by elements. But if I were to actually give one of these units here from tier 1, tier 0.5, it is pretty much gonna be Tyria, because Tyria herself has an insane amount of bulk potential to allow her to be tanky while still dealing incredible toughness bar damage, especially against green targets like Heidi as well as even Roberta, right? So you kind of just try for herself. I highly recommend running a HP so that she doesn't get one-shotted by the enemy squishy. So it is what it is. So this is going to be the tier that I'm going to be using for my PvP. You're going to see 4-piece HP and 2-piece defense, just highest possible amount of bulk as possible, while still having a decent amount of crit rate at 83% crit rate with 180 speed. So that's pretty much going to be that. And then for the next 3 units, which I have not personally stellar bloom, like for example Vera, right? I have not really stellar bloom Vera, but I think Vera definitely shows a lot of potential as well. You can kind of just see it from this particular stellar bloom thingamabob. So for this unit, it's pretty much just going to be all about a self-sustain as well as an additional moon recovery if you're going to be running her in a mono water team. So that is going to be pretty nice. Also removes quite a lot of debuffs as well while having additional 40% AV advance. So it depends if you do want to get yourself a little bit more free heals as well as free debuff cleansers from this particular unit, which is not going to be too shabby, right? Our next unit is going to be Bunny Charlotte. I would say that Bunny Charlotte, I have not really seen her in play for a while now. This is pretty much going to be my exact same PvE gear. I didn't really make another set for Charlotte because I think she's going to be relatively able to hold her own weight at 100% crit with 109% crit damage and 166% speed, which is why I am going to be opting for a little bit more of an attack rope just for this particular, or rather speed rope, just for this scenario while skipping all of the speed substats, right? So that is gonna be that for Bunny Charlotte. Absolutely insane DPS monster and easily killer of tank downs, at least if they do not have a whatchamacallit Hildy. Alright, another Nova Flare is definitely gonna be Ana, which pretty much acts as like a secondary healer as well as sustain. Additional self HP, additional speed, as well as the enemy with an attack down, which could be really good to remove the enemy burst DPS. And this is gonna be Please Stop Resisting, as well as a very plain vanilla level 4 unique passive. You can actually increase a random allies action gauge by 15% as long as you use your basic. And this basic actually triggers very easily because you're able to give yourself an enhanced counter attack if your ignition is gonna be a max dex. So even though she's gonna be a tank, the moment you are able to get hit, you can trigger this additional basic, which then gives your team another 50% action value advance, a random ally, so it's not going to be very consistent, but you can kind of think of this as like a mini Wells Ashra because of this 100% chance increased counter attack. So if you're going to be up against any enemy that's AoE, then this is going to be giving you a significant amount of value, which I can definitely see some play in RTA as well. And then for my personal Carissa, I mean, honestly, I have not used her in PvP for a while now, but I just gave her the highest possible speed, crit rate, as well as crit damage, which I would say is going to be looking very nicely. But it depends if you're going to be able to get yourself your skill tree as well as skill to it. If you cannot get enough speed, then just come back later in the future and do this when you unlock the full skill leveling against enemies. Alright, second last unit is going to be Bestia. I've played with her roughly 2 or 3 games. The way that your Bestia is going to be working is that she's just going to stand there unfazed. And though this particular repel, it actually does proc from the additional dupes. Yeah, so if you were to activate Bestia's Stellar Bloom, you are actually able to get yourself the additional activation of Repel, which is going to be the S2. If you get a 40% chance after being attacked by an attack that targets or an additional trigger triggers one. So it kind of is like a Roberta S2, except it is only going to be 40% chance as well as an attack that targets all. Other than that, it is not going to be too important. Her S3 is going to be giving your all ally defense up as well as self barrier, which is going to be a very nice defensive option. And an S2 is just going to be giving you attack down just to do a little bit more chip damage. If you're not careful, this S2 can actually hurt quite a decent chunk because both the damage as well as barriers for S2 and S3, they are going to be proportional to Bestia's max HP. Alright, last two units for my Luna is just going to be very standard. I didn't really change my Luna whatsoever, giving her 67% crit, 141 crit damage, a little bit more speed, 4-piece destruction as well as 2-piece valor for the highest possible amount of damage with AX5, so not too much to explain. And then for my Eliza, I'm still going to be opting for my Eliza that's going to be the slow build, so didn't really change too much as well. A little bit of speed, 187, 69,000 HP. You could maybe consider changing this to a HP main stat, but I don't really want my Eliza to be too slow, because if she's going to be a little bit faster, she can then proc herself the extra turn, which can then cause your revive a little bit more if you're going to be going towards the end game of PvP. Alright, and with that, I've pretty much just talked about every single major unit within the tier 0 into tier 2 tier list. For the tier 3 portion, it is not that they are bad, but I just really have not seen them like almost like at all for like my past 50 matches. Maybe I saw one match of like if somebody was wanting to use like Lily. I saw this one guy, he was like a Lily main, which is very, very interesting. I also saw this one other guy that actually tried running a, I believe Hardy. But now that I'm going to be able to have a lot of success, so I'm not going to be commenting too much on these tier 3 units. For my Scholar as well as Marcel Stellar Bloomers, if you've tried, feel free to let me know in the comments below. But this is pretty much going to be my definitive quick little RTA mid-season recap before Carnelia. Tier 0, tier 0, when all that comes out, I'll just post this onto the Discord section or rather the comments down below and let me know what you guys think. Word of the day is going to be wholly overworking. I'm actually a little bit cold. Join Twitch, join Discord, use code POKE, gamer subs. All the best for gacha pools, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care.